Okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Flight School Connector. We're just waiting for everyone to make their way in from the lobby. So we'll just take a moment to allow that to happen. And really glad that you're all here with us. And hopefully we're going to have a good topic. I know we got a great guest here today. So we'll get those intros started just momentarily. And the one thing you want to do is make sure that as you come in that your microphone is muted. A camera is totally up to you. And I think everybody is in. So let's get going. All right, so hi, my name is Chris Moser from AOPA. This is Flight School Connector, and today we are doing Surviving the Fine Print, Legal Issues for Flight Schools Explain. And so with me, of course, today is Stephen Schroeder, as always. You get to see him. It's normally a secret thing. You don't get to see him and don't get rusty, but he is here, so thanks Stephen, for being here and helping us run this. And then our special guest today is Mr. Chad Mayer, who is our attorney. So Chad, do you want to just introduce yourself just a little bit about what you do here at AOPA?
Sure. My name's Chad Mayer. I'm a lawyer with AOPA's Legal Services Plan, part of AOPA's Pilot Protection Services, which bundles some legal and medical services for individual members. Been with AOPA about 5 years, also a commercial pilot, ground instructor, UAS, a couple other things sprinkled in. And so I spend most of my day helping pilots, many of whom are CFIs, navigate various issues. Sometimes happy things like buying an airplane, sometimes unfortunate things like working with the NTSB on an accident or working with FAA on a runway incursion. But we see all kinds of interesting things, and happy to help go through some bullet points, answer some questions, help however I can.
Great. So really glad to have you here, Chad. And I know you're going to be a great resource, and can't wait to hear some of the advice or some of the experience that you can share with us today. Before we get started in earnest, we've got a couple things to take care of. One thing business-wise, just don't forget that make sure your microphone is muted. Although we will give you the opportunity, you will see the little icon. It's a little smiley face with a hand, so feel free to raise your hand if you do have a question. We'll definitely do a Q&A at the end. Also, feel free, please, in the chat box, you'll see it looks like a little cartoon bubble. Click on there and throw in questions, and we will, even as Chad or I are speaking, and we will make sure we try to address those as soon as we can fit them in, because we'd love to hear anything that you might want to know or specifics like that. So that said, we do want to make a short shout out to our sponsor, Sporty's Pilot Shop. They have a Sporty's dealer program. So if you're looking at some way to stock or start like a pilot shop in your school, this is a great program to check out. So check it out at sportys.com/dealer. Let me see if I can click on that and change that. One thing to note for you and your customers is that AOPA's flight training scholarships are now open. And so the application deadline is February 11th. So there is money for people that want to flight train. Please make sure you apply. I know that one of the requirements, Stephen, help me with this. I know one of the requirements this year has been getting the written test done for, I think it's the high school ones.
Correct.
Right. So there are less people actually completing applications. So if you've got some candidates, tell them to get in on this, because the less people that apply, not that we want that, we want more people to apply, but right now as it is, get folks in there, because there's money to be had. And so that's a great place to have it. So check that out, and you can, let's see if I've got the link there. There it is. Actually, you can email at ftscholarship@aopa.org, and then there's also aopa.org /scholarships. If you just Googled AOPA scholarships, it will come up, no doubt. So we've got lots of them right there. So various types. So check them out.
Money on the table. Have them apply.
Yes, please. Please make sure I have people apply. Okay. So here's what we're doing today. Today we're talking about legal issues. And so Chad and Stephen and I, we did a little brainstorming and thought, well, just based on things that we've heard flight school owners ask or in our conversations, or in Chad's experience too of talking with folks as part of the legal services plan, this is what we came up with. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to get legal representation. You can see lease issues and liability issues have been common things, regulatory compliance to TSA. I know one that I've heard about going to various conferences, and it's a recurring theme, is this employees versus independent contractors, especially when it comes to CFIs. So how to look at that. And then taking care of your aircraft. And if we've got time, we've got two bonus ones, which are talking about some business tips and then also flying clubs. So let's go ahead and get going. So Chad, The first one that comes up, and it's probably the one I hear most common when we would ask questions here in this forum, has to do with lease issues. And so we wanted to get some of your advice on what flight school owners can do to sort of make this as smooth as possible and as best to their advantage. What do you recommend to people about leases when it comes to hangars and things?
Well, one thing that you're probably going to hear a lot from me today is that you're going to need to read and understand the document. And unfortunately, we are seeing a trend of leases getting longer and longer. And it's not just, commercial leases for what could be a sizable flight school operation or shop at a big airport. It's, individual hangars, individual tie downs, all kinds of leases that used to be 10 pages. Well, now sometimes they're 50. And it's a burden, there's no doubt. But you got to read and understand it. If it, and best to do that with an attorney who's licensed in your state. That is something that we can help with referrals to get you pointed, in the right direction. But whether it's the building lease, whether it's equipment, whatever you're looking at, gotta read, gotta understand, and you might catch an error that nobody's ever seen before, and it could be meaningful. So I think that is really, item number one, regardless of the type of lease that we are talking about. Yeah.
Great. And so obviously that's really good news. And in fact, one of the things that I just wanted to double check here, I may have skipped there. I skipped it by accident, so we can hit this really quick. We'll come back to that slide in just a moment. What about when it comes to, and we'll talk about legal representation in just after this one, but when it comes to aircraft as well, what are some of the things there that you would see as, just because I know you've dealt with this a lot, what are some advice you would give to people when it comes to setting up a lease for that, for an aircraft?
So for aircraft leases specifically, I think you wanna know what your exit strategy is. Everybody goes in hoping and expecting that it's going to work out. I mean, frankly, if you thought it wasn't going to work out, you wouldn't sign the thing and you wouldn't agree to the deal. But when things go south, they can often go south pretty fast. And if you're really locked in for a year, say, and things go south 5 months in, you don't want to be wrangling or, bleeding money expenses, on a lease back that's just not working out. Now, the flip side of that coin is, you don't always want it to be just, hey, 30 days notice to quit without any cause, because, you want more stability in your operation. So it really is a balancing act there. But you want to make sure, again, read and understand. If it doesn't work out, how do you exit? What are the reasons you can exit the lease? What kind of notice do you have to give? Are you entitled to anything back if the person leasing you an aircraft, lets you down or doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain? Oftentimes it can be hard to prove damages. I mean, you're losing money. How do you quantify that? Maybe you build that into the lease. Okay, if you break X, Y, and Z term, you owe me a stated amount. Get it right out there. And that really comes back to read and understand. A couple other issues we see, owners who are leasing an aircraft back to a flight school, they often still think of the aircraft as their own. They might try to bump students off the schedule. You need to make sure that there's a system worked out where, if they have the right to fly the aircraft at all, because I mean, some of these leases are exclusive and some aren't. The owner needs to understand how to schedule the aircraft and not try to throw their weight around. That's a problem we see from time to time. And I didn't want to forget to expand just a little bit on the building and hangar.
Right.
At least if the airport is federally funded, there's going to be a minimum standards document that applies to every operator on the field. You want to know what's in there. You want to know what the insurance requirements are. You want to understand, as most of you all probably already do, that these are not residential leases. There's really no such thing as an expectation of privacy. And if the fire marshal is going to come in and inspect, then the fire marshal is going to come in and inspect. And you got to be prepared for those things.
Right, and of course, one of the key things there is as you mentioned too, for the hangar thing, is knowing what the minimum standards are. And I think sometimes one of the misunderstandings, perhaps, is that people will do construction, do lease, but they don't always realize that they're leasing that ground, definitely, and maybe the building itself belongs to the airport and not you. Correct? Is that something that you've seen come up too, or?
Yeah, it is something that we see, not as much as some other issues, but it is something that we see. One thing that people often seem to miss is that if you're, putting improvements onto a building that you don't own, um, generally you're adding new fixtures. Generally, you're giving those away at the end of the lease term. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't if it makes your life better. But you're just going to need to understand what your investments give you back in terms of any sort of ownership or not.
So we do have a question from one of our guests in here, the attendees. It says, how do you know if the airport is federally funded? So what would be a good way for them to check on that? Because I know that can often get into whether or not there's, I guess, minimum standards at a private field. There's not necessarily those same minimum standards we would see in the FAA.
Sure. So I know FAA publishes a list of airports and the grants that go to them. I don't recall the website, but if you can't find it, there's a resource that's less well known than the FSDO, and it's the ADO, the airport's district office. These are regional offices of FAA that deal exclusively with airport issues. And if you needed to find out something like, is this aircraft, federally funded, and you can't find it in a quick search, look up the number for the ADO covering your state, and that's the best resource to answer those sorts of questions.
Okay, so talk with the airport district office, and that's the on the FAA's website. You can find your local ADO.
Absolutely.
Perfect. And we got one other person asking or making a comment here. Let's see. It says taxation entities seem to waffle on aircraft that should be on. I guess aircraft should be on a short term, less than a year leaseback agreement. Then they change to a long term, more than 12 months. Thoughts or ideas? Anything you got out there, Chad, from that, or we can ask Lonnie to clarify.
If I'm understanding the question, I think that's something that we would need to get you referred to an aviation lawyer in your state to look at. If you're talking about state sales use tax or a tax that you'd have to collect when renting the aircraft out to the ultimate customer, the flight student. If we're talking IRS, I don't recall the IRS particularly caring about this aspect. So I think we're talking about state taxation, which I'm afraid I cannot speak to.
And that actually is a good segue, just back to the one I accidentally missed. Let me just hop back one slide here. So one thing that we wanted to mention is that Chad works with AOPA's legal service plan, which some of you as AOPA members may very well subscribe to. But one of the things, and maybe you can help clarify all this, Chad, is that is actually for an individual, unfortunately not for a business. Do you want to explain just a little bit more about that and about what service you could provide to flight schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that the legal services plan set up, it's what's called a prepaid legal services plan. Ours is exclusively for aviation, but they exist in other contexts. I mean, if you work for, a large company, they might have a prepaid legal services plan that gives you, hey, we're going to help you write a will, or we're going to help you with this and that, give you those sorts of benefits. Well, that's not what we do. What we do is we help individual members with aviation-related legal issues. Now, unfortunately for you all, a business entity can't be an AOPA member, so a business entity can't be a legal services plan participant because the legal services plan is available only to AOPA members. If you have an issue that is really about you, if you're a CFI and you get in trouble with the FAA, if the TSA is auditing you as a flight training provider, which both individual CFIs and flight schools are flight training providers, there are specific covered benefits where we can pay for a lawyer to help you out with that and actually write them a check. For other issues that are not specifically covered, for example, if the flight school itself has a legal issue that's not an individual issue, we can get you a free consultation, 30 minutes with anybody on our network, 650 lawyers in all 50 states. Those lawyers are in private practice. They're not bound by the same constraints as far as only being able to represent AOPA individual members and plan participants. So we're happy to provide that. And if you yourself are a participant, you can call our office. The phone number is going to be on a slide later. And even if you're not, we can still get you the names and numbers of the local lawyers. So we'll go over that at the end, I think.
Perfect. Yep, we'll have that at the end. We'll make sure we do that before we stop. And thanks, Chad, for clarifying that. So let me go ahead and I want to move. We're going to come up to liability here in a second. But before I do that, let me just pop back one slide. Steve Bateman's actually attending today, which is great. He's actually works here at AOPA with us, and he's our flying clubs guru. And he pointed out that he's got the information. If you're looking for that list or more information about whether an airport is federally funded, you can check out this website. It's Airport IQ 5010. He's got the link in there, so you'll see that in the chat. So check that out. And he even explains how to interpret it when you go look up an airport, the codes that are there. So check that out. And we are going to go ahead, just in the sense, I appreciate you doing that, Steve. We're going to go ahead and keep on moving, just because we got lots of stuff that we wanted to make sure that we touched on today. And please feel free to keep asking questions. Throw them in the chat there for us. All right. So one of the issues this is one that I brought up, just I thought that maybe flight school owners should be aware of, is just liability issues, in the sense of when we did a whole webinar a few months ago on insurance and that sort of thing, but we wanted to look at it just from that legal aspect. So Chad, can you enlighten us a little bit about some of the things that they should be aware of or think about when it comes to liability?
Yep, absolutely. First and foremost, I am glad that you put on the first bullet point there, that there's not a lot of serious or fatal accidents, and we're lucky that that's the case. And I know AOPA is regularly working to drive that rate down even more. What we see much more often is a prop strike, a ground loop. These things can certainly be expensive, but it's usually not people being seriously injured or killed. So at least we've got that going for us. But it's not hard to rack up a lot of dollars in aircraft damage from a relatively minor accident. And so I think, almost without exception, if you're talking about, an event that's going to need to be fixed, it's going to be more than the deductible, and insurance is going to be in play. And then we come to, well, what is the insurance actually going to do? I mean, typically the insurance is going to protect you. Our audience here is the flight school, who is the policy holder, and that's the main policy that we are talking about. So you all are in a situation where hopefully you've got good coverage, but I've seen it vary pretty widely how that coverage interacts with a student pilot or a renter pilot. Of course, if you're talking about a primary pre-solo student, I mean, it's the flight instructors, the pilot in command, it's a lot more clear cut. If you're talking about a solo student, or maybe a private pilot working on instrument rating or something like that, it can get a lot more complicated. And what we hear from pilots is they are not really understanding how this stuff works. They might hear, the flight school policy has a $5,000 deductible. Maybe I'll get renter's insurance for $5,000. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just self-insure and risk it. Well, most of the time it doesn't matter because nothing happens. But when something does happen, it can get messy. There are some flight school policies that really do protect everybody, including the student or the renter pilot. There are some that do not. And there are policies that subrogate and some that do not. And what subrogation means, for anybody who doesn't know, is that the policy is going to pay the policy holder. So, in a case like this, so a solo pilot, bends the airplane. The flight school insurance policy is going to write the flight school a check. And if that policy allows for subrogation, the carrier is actually going to go after the at-fault pilot to recoup the money that they gave to the flight school. Now, it's, again, varies widely. States also have rules on whether or not this sort of thing is allowed. But this is really going to come back to the read and understand, and not just for yourselves. For the student renter pilot who comes in, learning how to fly and is not savvy in this stuff, I think it's a best practice to try to help them understand your policy, how it does or doesn't apply to them, and what they need to do. I have seen a fair amount of flight schools that just say, hey, okay, we're going to require renter's insurance, or we're going to recommend renter's insurance, and that's they stop talking. Now, certainly that's the minimum that you would have to do, but I think it would be better to actually, connect the students with some insurance resources. And frankly, there aren't many. There are very few brokers. Those brokers generally work with the same underwriters, and you can only work with one broker at a time. They don't allow working with multiple brokers. So, I mean, if you let them know, hey, we have our insurance through X, maybe you want to call a Vemco. They're the only ones who write their own. They are the underwriter and essentially the broker. Vemco is just one company. So if you give the students the name of a broker and say you can call a Vemco for a competing quote, I think you've done them a great service, because they might not know their rear from a hole in the ground, and you're helping them kind of find their way, protect themselves. And when they're protected, that's a lot less potential hassle for you all running the flight schools.
Yeah, I would go along with you there in the sense of too is just helping avoid. We always want to provide the best customer service in a business like this, right? So it's really key. And so helping avoid when things happen, you don't want that to go out and spread. So helping them understand. And I do know for the insurance folks too, that they will be glad that they know those policies in and out. So they're typically very happy to talk to people. Maybe they'd even come up with resources for you to give to folks, to your customers, to help them understand what it is that this is covering and what it does. So I think that's really good advice. So obviously, I think what you're saying here, Chad, is make sure you understand your policy and make sure that your customers understand what your policy does and then why they may or may not need renter's insurance, how they're covered. So,
absolutely.
awesome.
And you make a great point about how savvy the actual, insurance players are. And I understand, a flight school might not necessarily want somebody working the desk or line spending all day trying to explain what the policy means. But you can just direct them to your own point of contact. And like Chris said, that person's going to be happy, very happy to explain how it all works and try to avoid future issues.
Yep, and I can answer all kinds of crazy questions, which is what they do all day long. So, okay, great. Let's go ahead and barring any questions, and again, just a reminder for folks that are in the audience, please feel free if you've got questions. There's that little bubble. It looks like a little balloon for a cartoon. Feel free to just type in a question that you may have, and at the end we'll have a Q&A session as well. You can also raise your hand then. We'll do it then and let you turn your camera and microphone on and ask questions as well then. So the next topic that we were thinking about just had to do with, we got a little theme going here of this regulatory compliance part I know coming up, Chad. So the first part was just when it came down to making sure that people are signed off, in this case, their training records, medical currency. Can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on just some of the things you've seen here regarding these types of topics?
Yep, and I will say the biggest problem that I see in this area is what I will call complacency. And, it's something that happens to pilots when they're flying, and maybe they skip the checklist the 100th time they fly the same airplane. And I see it happen to schools and individual instructors as well. They're just in a rhythm. They might know this particular student. They see his face 3 times a week for lessons, and not double check that everything is in place before giving or renewing a solo endorsement or signing off something else. I will say, for anybody who works with instructors who maybe are less active, or we're doing something else and are coming back to flight instruction, things that are second nature to us, like the fact that your student pilot certificate is now separate from your medical. Well, maybe that's new to them. It doesn't happen often anymore, but still once or twice a year, I will hear of an instructor who signed a student off to solo when that student didn't have a medical. They might check the student pilot certificate, not realizing, again, that those are separate certificates now, when they didn't used to be. They used to be all the same piece of paper, and of course now the student pilot certificate is plastic, and that ain't good. And then you got a problem that you have to try to unravel. The second bullet point indented there, we also see this when there's a switch. Maybe one instructor is out sick, traveling, who knows, and another instructor takes over that lesson. Well, maybe the student that we're talking about in this case, had everything, had a current medical when the last solo endorsement was signed, but maybe that medical expired last week. And maybe the instructor who's stepping in to renew the solo endorsement didn't check. So there's a lot of opportunities for this stuff to get missed. especially when there's busy schools. I know the hiring market is still strong. I know instructors are still getting hired away to the airlines and there's turnover. And I just can't stress enough how important it is to check all these things. And like a lot of things in aviation, I will say it's probably best to have a checklist and to use it every time, whether it's your ab initio student or whether you got 100 instructors and you need to make them get on the same page with this stuff.
Let me ask you a question there, just as an instructor to you, Chad, is that I've had that happen before where I get somebody that maybe another instructor had, and they come to me to do some instruction, and so they've soloed before. What's the legal part of, my default has always been, well, I want to make sure I review everything with you. If I'm going to sign you up for solo, I want to make sure that I've seen the things that are required for solo flight. What's the actual legal part of that? Is that something a CFI should do, is to observe these things, or are they okay to ride on the previous person's endorsement?
Well, I don't remember a regulatory authority, and don't quote me on this. I don't
Okay, fair
remember
enough.
a regulatory requirement for, a second CFI taking over, to redo things that have been signed off and documented. But I would say, you want to do, you want to adopt a common sense approach. And if somebody is a student pilot and maybe had a break, if they're new to your school, if maybe it's been 2 years since they soloed, you're probably going to want to do a little bit more rechecking and riding along than if an instructor that left the school 2 weeks ago after signing this person off. And maybe you were even there the day that they completed their pre-solo requirements or something like that. So, you don't want to take any chances. You also don't want to bleed the student dry, making them redo things
Right.
that don't make sense. So I would try to adopt a common sense approach to that.
All right, that's good advice. And then the last one, I know you put, particularly before we move on to the next slide, and we want to make sure we keep the pace going, but this was an interesting one. You said you've observed or heard this 141 school issue of people not following their own syllabus. So do you just want to make that quick comment on that? Just telling us what you
Sure.
saw.
This is something I've heard from students and trainee pilots at a couple of different 141 schools in the last year or so. It's not something that I'd heard previously, so I don't know if it's a new problem. I don't know if it's something that the FAA wasn't looking at as closely before, and maybe now they're doing more quality assurance checking. But what 141 is intensive. It's a lot of work to get the FAA to enter into that sort of scenario with you. You gotta keep up your end. The FAA is essentially giving the trainee pilots a break. There's gonna, you can complete your certificate in X number of hours instead of 250, whatever the case may be, but that's contingent upon doing all these special things that may not be required under Part 61, or the requirements under 61 might be a little bit different. And I would say, just remember, 61 is always an option, even at 141 schools. Sometimes it may be a better fit for an individual student pilot, but if you're going to do the 141, you absolutely have to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, because I've seen both schools. I've seen schools get in trouble for not keeping up with it, and I've seen, student pilots and trainee pilots working on more advanced certificates and ratings have to redo some training because they might have gotten sent for a check ride when they didn't meet the requirements.
Fair enough. And that's obviously important because it's like that whole 141 thing says this is what you're going to do. So make sure you do it.
Yep.
All right. So that said, we move on to maybe another level of this regulatory compliance, which I know that you brought this one up specifically, which is the TSA inspection thing. And of course, there's the joke of like, we're from the TSA and we're here to help. Can you tell us a little advice about what you would see along these lines for a flight school and things they should consider?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did the "we're here to help," because that actually does happen. And if it happens to you for the first time, you might be unnerved by it. But the TSA, I don't know if it depends on their bandwidth or if they have a quota, but separate from the audits that they do outreach, and they will sometimes just reach out to a school or an independent CFI and say, hey, how's it going? Do you have any questions? Is there any way that we can help you? Now, obviously, they're they're a government agency with whom you could get in trouble if you're doing something wrong. So you want to be careful. Maybe you want to call our office, run it by us. But that really is a thing that they do, as far as we can tell. Their motive is regulatory compliance, but there's not an ulterior motive, and they really do just do some outreach sometimes that isn't an audit, to try to help people get on track, who maybe didn't realize they were off track. One other thing I want to mention, even just putting these slides together, there's some hot off the presses news. The Alien Flight Student Program has been renamed to the Flight Training Security Program. This happened 2 weeks ago with very little fanfare. I just caught an update on their website. At the bottom, you'll see the old website and the new one, which it's the new one's up, but it doesn't have the little security credential. So my web browser says it's not trusted yet. So I don't think it's really ready for prime time. But the important thing here is there's no substantive changes to the program. I think they're just going with some more modern language. And thanks guys, it's another acronym we all have to learn, as if there weren't enough. But it's not AFSP anymore. This change has happened. It is the FTSP, and it really rolls off the tongue, right?
Love it. Perfect.
Yeah.
So obviously, and I know one of the points that you wanted to make here too is that you've seen this where it's people, they kind of miss it, probably not intentionally, but they miss it doing the training or missing a step after they do that discovery flight. So what's your recommendation there before we hop on to the next one?
Yeah, I think this is going to be very similar advice to what I had with, sign-offs and endorsements and things like that. I think you're going to want to make a checklist. If you have questions about this stuff, I think you actually going to want to call or email TSA. For a government agency, I think they are in the better half of getting a response in a semi-timely way. I don't think they would rather help you get on track than go through the hassle of a violation, generally speaking. But yeah, it's understand the rules, have controls, have a checklist, and remember, this applies to everybody giving flight training. This applies to large flight schools, independent CFIs, not associated with any school, are still considered flight training providers. And I see problems both with actual, like mechanical compliance with doing the required steps, and I see providers get in some trouble for not keeping records. There's some things that, you need to either sign, you need to keep for 5 years, this and that. And if TSA comes 3 years later and you don't have something you're supposed to keep for 5 years, that's a problem. So you really gotta have a solid record keeping system to verify that you did do everything right. And I will say, one particular problem that I have seen is well-intentioned providers, with non-citizen students who do have to get vetted. They may give the discovery flight, they go and start the vetting process, and then, they get the students interested, they want to get that certificate or rating. The provider schedules them for a second, third, fourth lesson and doesn't double check to whether they got the green light from TSA that the vetting is complete. The scheduled lesson rolls around, they fly the lesson, and only later discover that lesson, the second lesson, was flown before the vetting approval came in. So that's a particular thing that I've seen several times that I would say to watch out for. And I will say the good news, such as it is that a year or two ago, TSA put in something called their Action Plan program. It's a bit like FAA's compliance program, if y'all are familiar with that, the sort of kinder, gentler, that if you work with us to fix the root cause and prevent a reoccurrence, we're going to try not to drop the hammer on you. I've seen some good outcomes where something a couple years ago might have led to a fine, that the provider is now able to resolve things by saying, okay, look, I understand what I missed. Here's the changes that I've made to my, vetting and lesson scheduling system to ensure it's never going to happen again. There's a real chance at a happy resolution without a multi-$1,000 fine. But still, it's better to avoid getting in trouble in the first place.
Fair enough. And I know that Felipe, you've got your hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question just briefly here, and then we're going to try to keep moving because we've got lots of stuff we want to cover. So go ahead, Felipe.
This one might be a quick one, but it might be a long one. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but about 6 months ago, they sent an email saying that people on the visa, on a visitor visa, are allowed to do flight training. But really, nothing has come out of that. And I've reached out to them, and they've said yes. We've had people approved to train under a B1, B2 visa, but there's really not a lot of information about it. And before, I know it was like a big no-no, but I've had students approved already and are taking lessons. As far as it goes for our liability, are we liable, knowing like if the TSA says you're good to go, are we okay to train them, or are we still liable for, vetting visas or stuff like that?
Yeah, that is actually news to me that I think I missed the change in the visa policy, and I do not remember offhand all the different categories of visas that you all probably see a lot more often than I do. Since the folks you'd get in trouble with is the TSA, I mean, it sounds like you're on solid ground. Like with anything, I'd want it in writing. I mean, you don't need to get them to issue you a memo, but if you can get it in an email, I'd say that's good.
I asked them an email twice.
Yeah.
And the last response was, yes, it says it right there.
Okay. Well, I think I personally would feel pretty comfortable with that. So it sounds like they're moving in the right direction with that stuff. Maybe they'll get around to updating their website with it. But that is something I'm going to make a note about. I know AOPA has somebody in our Washington, D.C. office who does security in their government relations job. So that's something I would want to ask about. And, maybe AOPA could talk to TSA about making that guidance a little more clear in TSA publications.
Yeah, that'd be good because it's kind of scary, but they're approving it. Like, we're getting guys with B1s, B2s, and they're approving them.
And this was specifically for a visitor visa, you said?
Yeah, they're a visitor or a business investor or tourist visas. They're approving those.
I will follow up with our government affairs folks and just see if there's anything we can do to get them to kind of, clarify or remove any doubt about what they're doing.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Just a quick time check. We're at 12:37. So what we're going to do, I think, for this next set, we've got I think it's 3 or 4 slides. We're going to talk about independent contractors versus employees. So maybe we'll kind of go quickly through those, and then we can sort of comment at the end on that because it's the 3 criteria. And then, one person is asking a question. Jim's asking, is there a publicly available TSA internal guidance available similar to the various FAA orders like 8900.1? Anything you know of there, Chad?
I have never seen it, if it exists. The usual TSA guidance that I reference is they've got some opinion letters about, what constitutes training that requires vetting and what doesn't. It's your first FAA certificate, your instrument rating, your multi-engine rating. Other things that you might work on don't require that. But no, that's the extent of what I've seen is that type of guidance. I haven't seen a master, basically 8900.1 is like the FAA inspector's guide to doing their entire job. I've not seen that from TSA.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's what I want to do real quick is this is a topic that I've heard a lot from flight schools when I've gone to conferences and things. So we thought we would just do a quick overview just so you're aware of. And it's the idea of, especially it's typically CFIs that we'll see this with, employees versus independent contractors when it comes to terms of taxes. So the one thing that we've got here is that if you have someone who is an employee or classified as an employee, you have to withhold income tax. You've got to pay Social Security, Medicare, unemployment tax for them. But if you have them classified as an independent contractor, then you don't have to collect any of those taxes. They're supposed to do that themselves through the self-employment tax. But the key here is that I think that maybe sometimes schools might do this maybe for the ease of it, because that way they're not having to deal with all the taxes. They just say that our CFIs are independent contractors, but you've got to meet those definitions of those. And so the basic general rule, as it shows, is that the right to control independent contractor is a payer who has the right to, or the payer has the right to control or direct only the result of the work, not what or how it will be done. In other words, as the person who is hiring these independent contractors, all you can control is, did you complete the end of the work? How they get there is up to them completely. And does that sound true, like accurate, Chad, in the sense of being with that?
Yep, it does. I agree with all that. So you've got the citation there to the IRS website that kind of walks through these factors. And I mean, one thing you'll see there's a lot of factors to look at. There's very rarely any one test or any one thing that you can look at to make the decision. But when you look at all this stuff together, hopefully it becomes, pretty clear what the right classification is going to be.
Cool. So let's go ahead and of course there are implications. Like if you do misclassify an employee as an independent contractor and it turns out that they were really an employee, now you've got to pay all that tax and you're going to get hit by that, and that's maybe not something you were planning for. And so that can be something that can be reported by the workers. And again, all this is coming, just as Chad said, from that IRS website. So
and
there are.
Sorry, Chris, don't mean to interrupt, but I see a flag that recording stopped for the webinar. Stephen, do you know what's up with that? Are we good to continue?
I saw that as well. Menu says we're still going.
Okay.
Because the stop recording option is still available. That's an odd one. That's new.
Okay.
Well, we will plow on.
We'll hope that it's all working out okay. All right, so let's go ahead and just there's 3 factors, and we'll try to do these relatively quickly, just so we can get to some of the other topics before we stop. There are 3 factors that the IRS recommends that you look at, and the first one is behavioral control of an employee versus an independent contractor. So it's like if you're giving them instructions, when and where to work, types of tools to be used, where to purchase supplies and services, that makes them more of an employee. The more detailed control over their behavior makes them more likely to be an employee versus an independent contractor. And the same when it comes to evaluation systems. The employee, if you measure how the work is done, that's an employee. If you're just measuring the end result, that's more of an independent contractor. And so even like training a worker on how to do the job or not can lead you over to the fact of now they're more likely an employee. So there's not a black and white, but maybe Chad just mentioned this. It's that idea of it's leaning one way or the other, right? It's like comes down to this interpretation
Right.
from the IRS.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not like you could never offer training to a contractor, and it's not like you have to offer training to an employee, but those are factors. And I think the training kind of lines up with the degree of instruction. Is, how much are you actually micromanaging, for lack of a better word? Here, you do this, you do it that way, that's an employee. Just get it done, that's more of a contractor.
Right. The second factor to look at is your financial control over this person. So if you, and the IRS has mentioned this part about if you've put significant investment into the equipment the worker uses, and it says the IRS can view the airplane as a business, so I think that's something you added, Chad. And then do they have unreimbursed expenses? So unreimbursed expenses tend to be an independent contractor versus if things that they're using get reimbursed, then that tends to be an employee. Whether there's an opportunity for profit or loss. The profit or loss tends to go with an independent contractor. They're running their own business versus an employee who may not have any issue with that. And then even the method of payment, that regular wage versus a flat fee. A wage tends to be an employee if you're paying them by the hour. And maybe I'll let you comment on that one, Chad, the idea there of that, how that would work, because I would imagine that most of these folks are probably getting paid by the hour.
Most of them are probably getting paid by the hour. And I will say, I think the majority of flight schools have employees. You have CFIs who are employees rather than contractors. I don't know what the majority classify them as. I think the majority of flight schools probably have employees, but again, it's by no means universal. There are these factors to look at. I just want to lay out, one particular example about the equipment and the airplane. I mean, if there's 10 Skyhawks on the flight line, all owned by the flight school, that could be a factor that the instructors who are getting paid to fly them are employees. That same flight school might have a mix. Maybe there's an instructor pilot on the field with his own tail dragger. And maybe you can pay the flight school to get tailwheel instruction from that pilot in that instructor pilot's own airplane. And maybe that guy is correctly labeled as a contractor when some of the other CFIs at the flight school are really employees. So I don't want to give the impression that it's all one or the other. Certainly a mix can and does exist.
Cool. That's good to know and to be aware of. And then the last factor that the IRS mentions on this website is the relationship that you have. And so it's like they said, you might have a written contract, but just because it's necessarily written, maybe you make up a contract that says you're an independent contractor, yet you're going to do all these things, that does not make them an independent contractor. Stating it is not enough. It depends on all this other stuff. So if you're giving them benefits, probably not a contractor. If you're offering any kind of health benefits, if there's any expectation of permanency, in other words, the employee is going to be around for as long as they want, that's probably not an independent contractor either, because typically it's short term or some kind of limited term for a contractor. And then are the services that they are providing a key aspect of their business? And so I'll let you go ahead with this, Chad, because I think you added that other bullet on there. Consider seeking an opinion. So tell us what your thoughts are on these.
Sure. So I think the advice I would want to leave you all with on this topic is don't be the last word on it yourself. Look at this stuff, try to wrap your head around it, evaluate the factors, and see what you think the answer is. But I would strongly encourage everybody to call a CPA or a lawyer, with experience specifically with these matters to draft an opinion letter. Not only to try to make sure you actually arrived at the right answer, because if you're wrong, your belief that your decision was reasonable, you're going to have a much easier time pleading your case to the IRS that you reasonably believed the classification was correct, and you won't be in nearly as much trouble, and maybe not in any trouble at all. It is possible to be wrong about this stuff, but in a reasonable way. In such a way as that you won't actually get in trouble. It's just the IRS is going to tell you, hey, we disagreed. So don't go it alone. It's worth paying a professional, to look at all the factors themselves, give you an opinion letter, and rely on that.
One person does a follow-up question here from Bob. It says, does a CFI having a registered business file business taxes help the contractor's status? So does the CFI have, I guess the CFI that's being hired, and then they file business tax, does that help that status?
I would say that would be a factor in favor of viewing that CFI as a contractor. And that opens up even, another factor to look at is, does the CFI have any other contracts? Is that CFI getting 1099s from anybody else? Because even if that CFI is getting 1099s and, has his own or her own registered business, if all of their revenue comes from your flight school, it might not be enough to say that they're not an employee. So there's a lot of things to look at, but yeah, certainly in a vacuum, the CFI having their own business, I think, would be a factor in saying that they're probably more a contractor.
And then we've got another question from Van Zell. I think this is actually one that'll be great for a future topic, which is that they asked, will we talk about how someone can start their own flight school? It's more than just getting a CFI certificate and buying an airplane, correct? And so, yes, I would say that. And so that actually might be a great topic for a future webinar. We'll see if we've got time. I know we're running out of time, so I wanted to make sure that we did get to some of the other topics here before we stop today, because we want to be definitely respectful of your time. But Van Zell, don't worry, I've got that topic. I love it, and I think we will use that for a future topic coming up. We can really expand on that one.
Sounds good.
Okay. Aircraft acquisition. We've got just a few minutes left. It's 12:48, so we've got about 12 minutes. So what do you think, Chad? Tell us a little bit more, some of your advice here when it comes to getting aircraft, because we know this is a hot topic for flight schools.
It absolutely is. Title search is the first bullet point right there, hugely important. If that title has clouds, liens, encumbrances, they're the seller's problem unless and until you buy it. So I wouldn't buy an aircraft with a cloudy title. If you're borrowing money, a lender is not going to write a loan for an aircraft unless there's a clear title. So, usually those things can be cleared up. A lot of the liens that we hear about are 50 years old and no one's going to collect on them, but it's still a problem. And you don't want to buy that problem unless you're buying it at a substantial discount. And that's up to you. That's a business decision. But the general advice is only buy an airplane with the clear title. If you run a title search and it's not clear, have the seller fix it. And they're probably going to be motivated to fix it because it makes their airplane worth more. Inspection is also obviously, something that you want to pay attention to. There is no FAA definition of what a pre-buy inspection is. For that reason, a lot of potential buyers, flight schools or individuals, will just say, hey, I want an annual done because I know what an annual is. I know what it means. I know it has to be checked. But if you're not doing that, if you're doing some other kind of pre-buy and you don't have your own shop that you trust to do the right things, you don't want to just call up the shop you use and say, hey, I want to pre-buy, because you don't know what that means unless you go over the details with them. They might say, hey, our pre-buy is $850. Okay, great. Well, all you know is that it's not an annual. You don't know what they're checking, what they're not checking. So just make sure not only that you do the pre-buy inspection, but that you know what you're buying for that inspection money. Obviously, you want to pay particular attention to things that are known weak spots for particular types. So it helps, probably common sense. It helps to do the inspections at a shop that's familiar with the type if that's available. But like a lot of the things, read and understand what you're buying for your pre-buy inspection money. I know we're running short on time, so I'll try to cruise through this stuff. Escrow, I think, is generally a good idea. Again, anytime there's financing involved, the bank is going to demand escrow in addition to the title search and all that. Even if it's a cash deal, escrow protects both the buyer and the seller. And, most people are good people. Sometimes they make mistakes. Occasionally there's real scam artists out there. Having an escrow agent as the trusted third party to consummate the transaction, I think, is invaluable. And then just the final point is insurance. I mean, everybody knows that you need it, but not everybody is thinking about the exact timing. If you're in Florida and you're buying an airplane in Oklahoma, you got to add it to your policy for your Florida-based flight school. But when is the seller canceling their insurance? And, are you sure that coverage is, bound and effective by the time the ferry pilot takes off with the airplane that you now own, if delivery happened in Oklahoma? So got to make sure that all that stuff is covered.
Great. And that was a key one too. I didn't know about the part with the ferry flight of making sure if its insurance is covered, and you don't want it flying without that. So great tip.
Absolutely.
All right. Our last official topic, we've got 2 slides on this, but the last official topic, is aircraft maintenance. I'll do this one really quick because I don't think there's a lot here. I want to make sure Chad gets a chance to talk about this next one, which is near and dear to my heart. But the first part is that obviously, I don't see too many flight schools having an issue, but obviously when you're doing maintenance, make sure you're doing your 100-hour inspections, because obviously everybody does the annual. But if you're using the airplane for hire or for flight instruction for hire, then you need to be doing that 100-hour. Yes, you can overfly it by 10 hours per reg, but that's only to move it someplace to get maintenance done to it. So maybe you're based at a field that doesn't have that. Chad?
Yeah, one final point that I'll make is that I have seen folks get so hung up on the 100-hour inspection in particular that they forget that you can just do an annual. I mean, if you ordinarily do your inspections in February and the aircraft needs 100-hour in January, I mean, maybe it makes sense to just have the IA do an annual in January instead of do 100-hour and then the next month it goes down for annual again. So just keep that in mind. You can't substitute 100-hour for an annual when an annual is required. You can substitute an annual for 100-hour if you're due for the 100-hour. So keep that in mind.
Same inspection, just depends on who's doing it, correct? So, all right. This is the one before we wanted to make sure we covered this one. We won't unfortunately have time to hit our two bonus ones, but that's okay because this was a key one, which how to deal with inoperative equipment. I know I've shared that I've had my experiences with some of this stuff in my previous training experiences. So Chad, I want to turn this over to you. Tell us just your thoughts and some of your recommendations when it comes to when something is inoperative on an aircraft.
Sure. So I think the main thing I would want to convey is that there's a lot of sources that you need to check to determine that the aircraft is going to be airworthy with this equipment inoperative, which again, it's a separate question from is it safe? There are, however many parts on an airplane, lots, and there's probably quite a few of them that can be broken and you can fly safely. But there's not that many that can be broken and be considered to be airworthy. And you can't just look at one place. Everybody looks at, 91-205 and tomato flames and all of that good stuff. But when you look at 91-213, it kind of lays out the map of what you need to do before you can make that determination. I would, to avoid burying the lead, you don't have to make it necessarily. You can always ask your mechanic to check it. But some of this stuff is not necessarily stuff a mechanic has to do unless it's requiring maintenance to deactivate or remove the inoperative equipment. In that case, there's a bullet point there. That's got to be logged, and sometimes it has to be done by a certified mechanic. But going back to what we were talking about with the regulatory authority, everybody looks at 91-205. Not everybody looks at 91-209 about aircraft lighting. You'll see in 91-205 as an example that you only need anti-collision lights if your aircraft was certificated after some year that I can't remember. It doesn't say in there, but it does say in 91-209 that if you have anti-collision lights installed, that they must be operational. So you've got several different places that you need to check if you've got something inoperative that you're running down before you can pronounce it, unneeded and still airworthy. The others are listed here. The POH, the type certificate data sheet. Occasionally we see airworthiness directives that make a specific piece of equipment required when it might not otherwise be, without that AD. So this is not stuff to leave to chance. You can't just look in and say, who needs a clock? It's a clear VFR day. There's, there's some homework that you have to do. And I think it's better to have the aircraft, idle for a couple hours, when you could have been getting revenue for that block of time to make sure you get this right, than dispatch an aircraft that turns out to be unairworthy when you could have easily rectified it by recognizing this. And I'll just say, there's a shared responsibility here. The pilot in command has responsibility, but so does the owner operator. And so, whoever's dispatching this thing does need to pay close attention to this stuff and can't just leave it to the pilot.
And I think we had that in our initial discussion too. I had asked that question. I said if because I had that happen where a school that I had previously dealt with kind of was pushing me to go out and fly an airplane where the beacon wasn't working, and I was like, I'm not doing that because it's like I had been trained and I was like taught that's not what you're supposed to do. But you said that it's like, it says the pilot in command, but even if I went out and did that, then the owner operator can actually be liable for some of that too. If I were to get in trouble.
Yep,
right?
Right. It's all if you get caught, because if you don't get caught, everything's fine. But yeah, the pilot would have certificate exposure for suspension or revocation of the pilot certificate. The owner operator, not being an FAA certificate holder, just has monetary exposure, civil penalties, fines. So best avoided than dealt
Very
with
good
after.
advice. Okay, and so what I wanted to do is let's give it. We've got about 3 minutes left in our official time. Let me just go ahead. Whoops, what I'm clicking on there. Let's try clicking on that instead. We wanted to give time for a Q&A, but we also wanted to give the information here. If you want to contact AOPA or the Legal Services Plan where Chad works, this is the way to get hold of them. 1-800-USA-AOPA. Number 2 on the button gets you to the Pilot Information Center, who's got information about everything you can imagine. And then number 4 specifically gets you to that Legal Services Plan. So did you want to make any comments there?
Sure. I will just say, even, for people who don't have the legal services plan, and for businesses who can't be members or participants in the legal services plan, but just want a referral to local lawyers, with aviation expertise, they can call the Pilot Information Center. Pilot Information Center can look up the list of attorneys in our network. They can look at your zip code. They can, email you a list of attorneys in your area with aviation expertise. Obviously, you got to discuss their rates with them before you retain them, but I think that's pretty standard. But yeah, you can access those resources directly from Pilot Information Center for things that might be covered under the legal services plan. For example, if you are a CFI and you're with a student and there's a runway incursion or a TFR bust, that is something that we cover directly. You can call us at the legal services plan. Even if it's not directly covered, if you call through the legal services plan and you're a participant, we can connect you with a free consultation with those local lawyers as well.
Perfect. And that's good advice. And we maybe have time for, if somebody's got a question, please feel free to post it. While I'm waiting for someone either to raise their hand if they've got one or that, let me just do the wrap up part, because we're coming to the end of our time. Reminder about those scholarships that I mentioned before. But really, coming up, we've got a couple topics coming up. I love that topic that was suggested, so we're going to put that on the schedule about how to start a flight school. So we will do some research into that, and I think that's a great one. And then right now we've got planned for February, scaling up your business. So if you're interested in trying to expand out, especially as our awards happen in February, we'll be talking about that next month. And then in March, we're going to see if we can get somebody to come on, and we're looking at talking about using a simulator to help your business. So those are the key things. So I just want to give one more opportunity for anybody to ask a question if you've got one. And barring that, we're going to keep an eye on that. I do want to just make sure I thank Chad. It was so great having you here. And we really appreciate the time you took to spend with us. And we're excited for all of you folks to be here too. So I'm hoping you've found this valuable. And I don't see any questions. So I know we're coming to the end of our hour, and I want to be respectful of your time because I know you're all busy running a school, and we hope that you'll join us again next month. And so thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Stephen. Special shout out and thank you to Steve Bateman, who did my tailwheel training. So appreciate you sharing the FAA link.
Yes. Yes, Steve, we appreciate that too, the airport ID thing. Thanks. Okay, everybody, let's have a good day.
All right.
Bye all. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.